just maybe as a way of background, I just want to also say that Mice and we have share a background of working together before. Mice has also contributed to my book kindly, but I've also we share experiences of working also as parents in this sector. So it's nice to be speaking with you, Mice, also today. So thanks very much for having me. Indeed, as Tom mentioned, we'll be speaking today about, well, the working culture in the aid sector and how it affects humanitarian workers. And ultimately also how it affects how the work is being carried out. And yes, so as Tom mentioned, I am basing the talk on my book called The Humanitarian Parent. As you can see the cover here in the picture, just as way of background to say, the picture has been done by a Syrian illustrator, Haya Halal, who is fabulous. And if you need ever illustrations, please be in touch with Haya for future work. But in any case, the book, it's an anti-colonial and feminist take of the humanitarian workspace in many ways and relies on extensive secondary sources and also 50 interviews I conducted with aid workers, both working nationally and internationally in different settings around the world, as well as with different experts. But it's also a very deeply personal account. And hence, as a way of background, I just wanted to start by saying a few words about how it all started and about myself. And so I want to go back to 2015. I had just finished working with UNRWA, actually in Gaza, where I had just come out from working on the 2014 Gaza war, which many of you might recollect. At the time, I was coordinating UNRWA's WASH programming. So mainly responsible for water deliveries to UNRWA schools that had become emergency shelters similarly to right now. But of course, the context is even much worse this time. But the work in many ways had been profoundly meaningful and something that had deeply impacted me. And well, you can also imagine that right now it's not so easy to speak about anything else than Gaza at the moment, but here goes. But so in 2015, I moved to Amman. I continued working with UNRWA there, and ultimately I wanted to move there, in all honesty, because I wanted to have a baby. It's something that being in Gaza didn't allow for foreigners, as it was categorized as a non-family duty station for us. And so we had a baby while I was working in Jordan, and then another one later in 2018. And but let's just say that the work with UNRWA in Jordan was not quite like the work that had been in Gaza. But once I got pregnant, it became very evident very quickly that I had done something that was not quite fitting for the humanitarian workspace. The news was met with disappointment from many long-term humanitarian workers I knew. I felt it was seen that I had given up on working on the sector because I had chosen to have children. Well, the critics obviously knew something that I hadn't accepted at the time, and I still kind of naively believed that one could have it all, but little did I know that having children was far from compatible with the sector I was in. Where having it all meant that yes, you are able to have children, but you may become estranged from them if you continue to work and progress in the sector as you might wish to, at least. Next slide, please. But others shared my experience, and so during this talk, I'll bring out some of the quotes from different interviews from the book. And here, for example, is a quote from Mary, who was a long-term humanitarian worker and a gender expert I interviewed for my book. And she says when Mary announced her pregnancy at work, her program director did not take the happy news very well. "Oh my God, not another one," the program director had responded. There's below another quote from Susie, who's also a long-term aid worker for different international organizations. I will let you read that quote yourself. But when I got pregnant with our second baby, I was working on the cross-border response to Syria with IRC. And this is actually where we met with mice, and because we were working together at the time. That was also an extremely difficult time. The government of Syria took over South Syria. Many of you may recall, it meant we lost most of the programming we were doing in the south. And the staff linked to the programming, not only did they become unemployed, many became displaced and feared for their lives, having been affiliated to an international organization. Not that dissimilar, of course, from many other contexts that have happened in this world. And at the same time, we lost access. Our programming got cut, of course, because if we don't have access, you don't have programming. Because of that, I lost my job, which is not that atypical in the aid sector, of course, but I was 8 months pregnant at the time. And I was very struck with the absurdity of both my own privilege vis-a-vis, of course, all our colleagues inside Syria, let alone, of course, the people who we were working with and serving who did not have income from working on an international organization to begin with. And yet I was also going through perhaps what could be seen as contrast, a middle-class crisis of losing my job towards the end of my pregnancy and realizing how poor many contracts in the aid sector were, with many jobs either project-based or consultancies, of which many provide little, if any, benefits or leave or job security. Or then roles with, for example, local civil society organizations that can be at times very poorly paid, sometimes even called volunteer positions, as many of you may know. So in the international food chain or humanitarian food chain, I was still doing quite well, having had international positions, both with UN and NGOs, and I could in many ways rely on finding my way in the long run. I kept thinking, of course, about the staff in Syria, who were deeply impacted by the conflict and layoffs as well. And had anyone ever considered whether any one of them were pregnant, for example? And my situation could, of course, not compare with theirs. Yet, I think what also made me start writing the book originally was that the humanitarian workspace still had been quite a ruthless place for a parent, at least from my Nordic labor rights standpoint. I'm just to disclose, I'm from Finland. So in addition to my situation, I have spent a lot of time talking to other parents, trying to understand their situation with the long working hours, with the travel, often with experiences being away from children for extended periods of time, experiences that mother and fathers both on national and international positions actually shared, and also mothers from the global south, like mothers from the global north. So mothers and parents were used to passing on work opportunities, for example, regularly because of having children, many used to being unemployed because of having children. And then there were the people who wanted to become parents, but for whom continuing to work in the sector made it difficult to find long-term relationships or needed access to healthcare, including IVF, for example, as well as to access to adoption, for example. Next slide, please. So there's this notion in that children are a choice. I think what you often hear in this sector, and you either choose children or the work. Yet when I spoke particularly to mothers from some countries in the global south, many rejected this notion of choice in having children in the first place. When I asked, for example, a Nepalese aid worker, Aditi, whether she had considered if she wanted children when she started her career, she was quite bewildered by the question overall and said, "Your question doesn't work for me. In my culture, we don't think about those things. We're going to get married and have children anyway." And so what does that mean for people like her if the sector is unable to accommodate for parents to work in it? Does it exclude completely women like her from the workforce? So there is nothing new in saying that the whole humanitarian system is founded on deeply colonial roots. It's profoundly unequal, and that the workspace is formed around a certain type of white male who went around helping people, leaving his own children and family behind, possibly in the closest R&R duty station or a boarding school, for example. And these diehard humanitarians, as many of the interviewed put it, they're always flexible, right? Always ready to prioritize work over family. And this, of course, still happens. Next slide, please. The notion of flexibility is something that parents struggle with significantly. And here is a quote from Mirja, who's a single mother working for the UN, and she said the following: "If you look at job descriptions in the humanitarian field, both emergency and family duty stations, they always require flexibility, which means doing overtime, working during weekends, going on missions. Even if you can perfectly get your work done within reasonable working hours, it's still well seen if you stay long in the office and come in on the weekends. Efficiency is not appreciated. If you don't work overtime, you are somehow perceived as less relevant or reliable or committed. I don't understand this attitude, and as a single mother, this is absolutely impossible." So in addition to the colonial background, I argue that the sector is dealing with compassion fatigue, which is often linked to burnout related to secondary trauma and feelings of inadequacy or guilt for one's own privilege, and the consequent inability to empathize with others, or managers' inability to empathize with, for example, their own teams. Now, this premise has created a workspace that leaves very little room for staff who might have their own priorities or a life cycle where they have different needs and vulnerabilities that influence the humanitarian staff themselves in many ways. Many of the good contracts available in this sector, they offer money to accommodate the dependence or the lack of time that staff have. With good contracts, there's housing allowance, there's dependency allowance, there's education grants, there's decent salaries, and many who continue to advance in their career tend to do so with the money that enables, for example, for nannies, and who make up for the lack of work-life balance in the sector often. And particularly those in leadership positions who can make decisions that affect others are often well taken care of themselves, actually, at least financially, which doesn't necessarily encourage making or changing the sector. And hence the workplace doesn't really change. It doesn't need to change. The staff, even with the increasing diversity, they adapt to the workspace. There are loads of stories of parents and mothers who impose the challenging working culture on other mothers. And this is, for example, a quote from a story from Isabella, whose duty station, it changed while she was on maternity leave from being a family duty station to being changed to a non-family location. And the organization itself, it made no accommodations for her. And the quote goes, "I had a phone call with them. They were 3 mothers. The country director with grown-up daughters, the human resources manager, and a 3rd one in New York who was actually pregnant. The 3 of them asked me to leave my baby behind. They said that there were other parents in my duty station away from their children," which was true, but they were struggling and they were not breastfeeding their children. So as I quote in the book Sarah Ahmed, who has put it saying that diversity of staff in an institution of whiteness will not do much. It will just hide racism, meaning that just increasing diversity will not necessarily change the working culture of a sector. And it seems that the same thing has happened with gender. While the aid sector continues to be an institution of whiteness, it also continues to be an institution of patriarchy, no matter how many women climb up the ranks. Next slide. But also, women do not always equally climb up the ranks. So there is quite a bit of data, especially for the UN, which demonstrates that while professional positions, especially in the starting and mid-career levels, they have more women than men. The higher you go, the more women drop out. So here, for example, you will see international roles with the UN. You can see that while in the P1 and P2 positions, so the starting professional positions, they're mostly women, now with P1 at 67% and P2 with 59%. Already at P3, you can see that, that the majority are men, and the further you go, it increases. Next slide. Here's also an interesting table. I don't know if you can see it or if it's too small. Hopefully it's not too small, from WFP specifically. It's very similar, actually, to the overall UN. The top one shows international staff, and you can see that at the P2 level, there is still more women than men. And again, the higher you go, the vastly more men you have. And very similar trends to, indeed, to the overall UN. But below, which is interesting, the below table is national staff. The differences are not as clear, nearly as clear as for the internationals. One great difference for national staff is that men are dominating at all levels, actually. Next slide. But possibly the most interesting table is from UNFPA, which I think, as many of you will know, is an organization focused a lot on sexual and reproductive health rights, GBV prevention and response. And even there, you see a shift from P3, which has much more higher numbers of women, as opposed to also the kind of medium of other UN organizations. But then to P4, it changes again, and men are the majority. So women tend to be dropping out at kind of mid-career level, once they hit kind of more expertise and experience. So what are the challenges parents then face in the humanitarian sector? I tried to look at the realities of parents in different life situations also in my book. Many of the identities, they of course overlap. I'm gonna here during my talk just raise a few examples from different parents in different situations. An example from somebody in national roles, also LGBTQIA+ parents, single parents, but also trailing spouses and fathers. So next slide. For staff working on national contracts, there's a lot of stereotypes. There's a presumption that they are all local. And there is a presumption, especially that they are staff in the global south and that they have networks to support with childcare, often extended family. The problem is that this is not certainly always the case. Many do not have childcare support from family, and many have to travel for days to see their family. And in practical terms, they're actually internal migrants in a country. Yet their contracts, they never recognize those needs, that they need to see their family, for example, or pay for childcare. Here's a quote from Hadil. When she was working for an INGO, there was an expectation that because she's in her home country, she would have the network to care for her child so that she can travel, the needed travel, and do the long hours. And she says, but I hadn't. I literally hadn't. My sisters were working and my mother was sick. She was not able to take care of the child. And then my husband's family were always like, no, I couldn't even ask. So it's overestimated that the network is there. It will support you, the village thinking. Next slide. Another example of how national staff can be treated comes from Chose, who was working for a UN agency during COVID, actually in Myanmar when I talked to him. And he was working away from home as well, hours away from home. In many ways, he was as an internal migrant, as mentioned, in a kind of a different duty station than the family was staying in. And there was complete lockdown, and he had to stay in his room for almost 2 years with little opportunity to visit home. But even to have, but he also didn't have, he had barely any social interaction in his duty station. He was working with refugees. He didn't visit refugee camps. He didn't do any of the things that would have been enabled by being in a duty station away from his family. But yet, according to the policy, he was not allowed to go work from home where his family was, and he had to stay at his duty station. But he had not even requested the agency for the approval to go home. And when I asked him why he hadn't made that request, he said, "I am afraid." He would have been the first national staff member to request such an exception. The whole extended family relied on his income, and he didn't dare to raise it. He wanted the agency to care for the staff, though, and he would have wanted them to ask what he needed, and then he said he would have raised it. But they didn't ask, and he didn't dare to say. But he did want empathy. And during those years, because his children were very small, he had become completely estranged from his small children. Next slide. Here's another example from LGBTQI+ parents. It's good to remember that there are only 33 countries where same-sex marriage is legal at the moment, making it quite a challenge for LGBTQI+ parents to take on work globally. There's simply administrative issues, such as acquiring visas for spouses. Some come into countries, spouses come into countries with either tourist visas or as domestic employees in some instances. Staff of humanitarian organizations also may not know how to deal with, for example, a gay staff member and their rights, for example, in terms of parental leaves. And there were interviewees who spoke about this difficult situation to having to come out again and again to, for example, colleagues in human resources, etc., or having to explain their situation, especially to staff who may disagree with their sexuality. So support in finding out information on situation for gay parents in different countries. But many have found a way to manage by doing their own research generally. Here is a quote from Chrissy, as you can see. So she, for example, became familiar with a group about queer Tbilisi when she was thinking about moving there, and it wasn't a very positive site. She says, basically, there is a list of people who have been murdered, mainly if you are trans, lots of people getting killed, lots of negative. Gay people and families new to a country would ask how gayness was perceived. And if you then get 5 comments, yes, you can go there, or you get 100 comments that say, don't come, don't be out, then you quickly get a sense. So basically they make their own research and quite quickly see the different atmospheres in different places. Next slide. So my next example is about trailing spouses. I think it's a concept that's quite familiar to a lot of people. Having a partner and a child will often require some periods of trailing from the other spouse in the sector, basically meaning periods of unemployment for one parent to enable the work of the other, especially moving countries, but also many roles that simply come with a lot of travel may require that one parent is at home dealing with the needs of the children as the other one focuses on their work. The problem is that many do not come to understand this when they decide to have children. It is also easy to get stuck in trailing. One parent has a good contract with which it is very easy to move the whole family, and then the other one stays at home and builds consecutive gaps in their CV, and it may be hard to then alternate in a way that the other one then in turn has a good enough contract for the whole family to choose to move again. So original plans don't always work out that way. And it can become really excruciatingly bitter for the one who continues to be unemployed and possibly loses their whole, career. Or I think oftentimes also we estimate how much the work is linked to simply our identities. Well, here's a quote from Andrea. For me, the measure of what I did is still so much linked to be able to say, I went there, I did this to be productive. I have one example, next slide, please, on single mothers. For single mothers, I think many feel it's simply impossible to continue to do the work, period. Some raise the issue that there is an expectation of a spouse always, if there is a child. When one arrives in a country, you should, for example, you're expected often to immediately start working. And that's often linked to actually the work permits that people get in the sector, that they're linked to immediately going to work. Here's a quote from Rose, who is actually a country rep for the UN, who said, I have turned up in offices where I'm head of office and people think I should be able to start working within 3 hours. People just assume that there is someone behind the scenes. And in her instance, that obviously wasn't the case. But on the flip side, some parents actually who I interviewed felt that the happiest people in the sector are those who've had children on their own often. And what they mean is that these people can themselves decide where the child will live, and they don't have to follow any other parent, for example, because of it. So in this case, for example, divorce does not mean that a parent has to continue following the other one because of the children after divorce, which is quite a typical phenomenon in the sector and for these kind of trailing ex-spouses, actually. I have one more example, which is for fathers, and that's on the next slide. I have a long chapter in the book about fathers as well. Many fathers I spoke to shared very difficult stories about missing childbirth, seeing their children grow up. One father I interviewed didn't share a language with his child, who had been brought up learning her mother's language in the mother's country of nationality while he was working with the UN. And here is a quote from an Ethiopian father who was working for an INGO, who said, I used to have nightmares about going home and my daughter not recognizing me. We used to do video calls every day, so she would be familiar with my voice and my face, so she would not cry when I go home and think I'm a stranger. So what next, I suppose, is then the final thoughts. Next slide. Much has happened, of course, over the last years. COVID-19 brought many flexible policies, including teleworking, to this sector, where such policies had been quite foreign, as many of you might know. But unfortunately, there has been significant regression in those policies, and much has been removed since COVID. Some of you may remember this meme that was going around after COVID restrictions were being lifted. And even where the policies do still exist, often flexible policies are to be used on the supervisor's discretion. And that means that they're often more easily available to international staff that hold more power and privilege in the sector than national staff. Change must indeed happen, but I suggest that enabling diversity, including diversity of experience and skill in the humanitarian workspace, does not come necessarily with providing more financial benefits, at least not to those who are already well earning. Rather, it will come with ensuring psychological safety by creating more equality between staff and also between organizations. And I suggest that if the workspace would better enable parents to actively and openly parent while they are part of the workplace, then the humanitarian programming would also be better in tune, understanding the needs of parents and children that ultimately make up most of the people served by the humanitarian assistance. Our experiences, they do support us in developing compassionate empathy that translates to actions and supports us in the path to developing better programming. There are examples of the importance of psychological safety. There's, for example, a study on a team's performance with Google that demonstrated that the highest performing teams all experience psychological safety, basically allowing everybody to speak their mind, be creative, make mistakes. If someone, for example, is shunned for leaving at 5 p.m. to pick up their children from daycare and made to feel that they are not appreciated as a team member for it, then the team will not benefit from the potential of diverse experience that ultimately the mother will try to conceal from the team. Next slide. Here is an example from Susie, for example, who said, "I used to cry when my child would cry during a meeting at nighttime because I could sense my supervisor getting pissed off and I would worry I simply cannot lose the job." So I suggest that we should be, as staff and as organization, more empathetic to each other's needs and situations throughout our life cycles. Equal access to policy does not mean that every flexible policy needs to be available to every person in every role at all times. We will all have different situations at different parts of our lives. And at times we can be very flexible. And at another time, we may need to be at home caring for a sick parent, for example. Here is another example, if you turn the next slide, from Ala, who went through a series of extremely traumatic miscarriages, but with little support from her organization. And when she was miscarrying, she was actually at the same time responding to a recent earthquake in Syria, which many of you may remember. She said, "I was working 16-hour days and I was on my phone still in the hospital bed going into the procedure to remove the fetus." Allah knew they were, of course, responding to in an emergency context, but felt there should be something in place to address her vulnerability in the situation. And she continued her comments saying, "I feel like I'm always expected to empathize and to give. And then when you are yourself in that same situation, why cannot I also have that empathy? Why do they not see my needs?" I also suggest changing office culture by improving flexible policies and starting to measure that they are being implemented. Make managers and senior staff responsible for their implementation. Make them explain why they are unable to implement a certain policy. UNICEF, for example, has started doing this, requiring this in the performance evaluation of managers. As many others, I also suggest that humanitarian workspace should embrace feminist leadership, which in the end seems like an uphill battle in a sector where the workspace has been quite the opposite, embracing effective implementation over empathy often. But there are organizations such as ActionAid that are implementing 10 principles of feminist leadership. They include principles such as, sharing power, transparent use of power, caring for others, respectful feedback, etc. I just want to finish with the next slide and some final words on Gaza. I started the book with an experience of working with women who had given birth during the war in Gaza in 2014. And obviously this experience couldn't be more topical at the moment. We know that approximately 50,000 women are currently pregnant in Gaza, and 180 women give birth every day. I do not suggest that simply by having given birth, one could understand the experiences of pregnant women in Gaza or what they're going through. But I do suggest that we need the diversity of experiences to have teams that are able to address the different needs of different people. And parenthood should not be underestimated within those experiences. And finally, I want to conclude by making a final tribute to some colleagues in Gaza as well. The latest news, as you may know, is that 168 UNRWA staff have been killed in Gaza since 7th of October, and certainly much, much more if we calculate all humanitarian staff. Many of them are also parents, including one of my former colleagues, Walla, who was killed with her 5 children, or another colleague, Husni, who is a father of 2 and who was killed last week, bombed in the UNRWA warehouse while he was providing services. And there's another one I spoke recently with who was pregnant with her baby 8 months. Quite a different reality she was living as a humanitarian worker than me being laid off at my 8 months of being pregnant. You simply can't compare. And I think this is in the inequality also of the humanitarian workspace is what makes it so complex. We should always, of course, keep in mind our privilege and power and continue to improve the workspace for all its staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Merit. Very powerful presentation. And before I pass over to Mais for her reflection, I'd just like to ask anybody, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat and we will ask them to Merit and Mais after the reflection. So I'll just hand over to Mais now. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom and Merit, for the intro and the discussion. So as Merit mentioned, both in the book and in the presentation, that local employees or national staff inherently possess a robust personal and social network to sustain the demanding work schedules expected of them. But this is not always true, unfortunately. Each individual situation is unique. We have a case-by-case scenarios. We have individuals with different capacities, different vulnerabilities. While some may indeed have these networks and the support from the extended family and from the family, others do not. My observation suggests that organizations should not take the presence of these support systems for granted for everyone. The book casts a spotlight on the disparities perpetuated by the humanitarian system. Drawing from my own experience as a former UN staff member, I was offered a more flexibility and more support. However, in stark contrast, as a local staff member, I felt compelled to work even during my maternity leave due to my fear of losing my job and the financial security it provided. Overall, despite the major steps towards gender equality and equity within the sector, we as women and parents in the humanitarian sector still face discrimination and often marginalized through unequal pay and limited career advancement opportunities, which is clear from the graph Merit projected, and most importantly, inadequate support for work and life balance as well. These discriminatory practices will result and may result in fewer opportunities for women and mothers to take a challenging assignment or leadership roles that are critical for their career advancement. Women, especially mothers, may struggle with balancing the demands of the humanitarian sectors with family responsibilities and child parenting in general and taking care of children. Merit mentioned school pickups, school drop-offs, etc. And without this adequate support, this can lead to career interruptions or the decision to leave the sectors altogether. I know so many colleagues who were brilliant, who were amazing, but unfortunately, because of the lack of support by the system and by their social network, unfortunately, they had to drop off and leave the sector overall. It is crucial to consistently explore the interactive balance between professional duties and parenting that both local and international aid workers must navigate. Humanitarian parents delves into the inadequate support for working mothers, fathers, single parents, LGBTQI+ parents, and how cultural expectations can aggravate these challenges. I do support and highly connect with Merit's overall recommendations, and this is my reflection. Thank you very much.